Hello and welcome to our IT Pro webinar, Beyond Email Security, Rethinking Your Customer Data Silos for GDPR in association with Mimecast. I'm Joe Curtis, Deputy Editor of IT Pro, and with me are Cybersecurity Analyst Bob Tarzey and Dan Sloshberg, Product Marketing Director at Mimecast. Welcome both.
Thank you. Thank you.
So this webinar, really, first of all, we're going to focus on talking about the type of email security threats you can expect to face and are facing today in your organization and how to defend against those. And then we're going to talk about how GDPR will affect the way you treat your email data. So I think we should start with email threats. So email's been around since 1972, but it's still the #1 way for businesses to communicate internally and externally. And obviously that makes it a huge attack vector for hackers. So I think maybe if we start with the type of email threats organizations are facing and how they can defend against those. The most obvious one that comes to mind is phishing attacks. How, in your experience, Dan, how prevalent are phishing attacks day to day, and what are the types of data that phishing attacks are trying to get their hands on?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think the type of threats that we're seeing have changed quite dramatically, from more sort of simplistic, sort of scattergun type of approach to becoming more targeted. And phishing, or the more targeted form of phishing, is in terms of spear phishing, is becoming more and more prevalent. We're seeing more of it. And I think, to your point, email is such an easy way in. It's this internet-facing tool, and basically anybody in the world has the opportunity to put something in your inbox. And if they are clever enough to get you to do something with that. And phishing is part of that. So whether it's trying to trick you into clicking through a link to a bogus website that trying to get you to put in your login credentials, but actually it's not the site you think it is, and your credentials have just been stolen. And unfortunately, even today, people are still using the same credentials across a number of different websites and systems. So if they can steal your details in one area, perhaps that's going to give them a good chance of getting into another system. Credential theft certainly is one sort of area of phishing, and phishing for information of any type. It could be trying to get you to disclose certain information about your company, products that you're working on, sort of corporate espionage. Although we don't see as much of that, but certainly in our experience, Mimecast, we see the click through to a site, or including an attachment of some sort of malicious code. Again, in that phishing mail, trying to get you to click. That malicious code will then go onto your system and sort of spread within your organization.
Sure. So Bob, Dan mentioned you've got spear phishing and phishing attacks. One's very targeted, one's maybe more of a throw everything against the wall and see kind of what sticks, in terms of trying to get just one person potentially to open that email. What kind of particular methods are phishing attackers looking to use, and what do you think they're generally trying to get from a target organization?
I think you identify the fact that there's two approaches. One is the mass approach, where you say, well, I've got a list of 1 million email addresses here. Let's send out our phishing email and see who responds, see what we can catch. That's where the term comes with. So you're waving your rod in this sea of email addresses and seeing if you get some sucker to bite. Beyond that, once you've identified an individual who is responding, and here we're at risk as consumers. So if as a consumer we said, oh yes, I must respond to this email, and you suddenly will give something away, then the attacker has the next step towards getting the information they might need to compromise your bank account, let's say. And then it becomes a targeted attack. Now they're onto you as an individual. That's when it becomes a spear phishing at the consumer level. I think at the business level, quite often you will say, well, we want to get information of some sort from this organization. Let's say you're a nation state attacker, that's somebody working on behalf of a government of some sort or whatever. who decides they want to steal intellectual property from a manufacturing organisation, let's say. So they know the organisation they need to target. So they're already targeted insofar as an organisation is concerned, but then they've got to find the vulnerable individuals within that organisation and persuade somebody to give that information away. And of course, that is the other side of email security, is the people within organisations who, for what might be they think are good reasons, start sending information out that they shouldn't do. So it takes two to tango with email. It's a two-way process.
Yeah, very much. So how do you go about defending against that?
Yeah, it's we talked about the threat landscape changing, and effective protection has changed dramatically. So arguably the attackers are going to always be a step ahead of the defense. They're very motivated. They don't get anything unless they're successful. And increasingly they're starting to work together rather than just sort of lone people on their own. These are actually sort of becoming more organizational, like where you have people coming into an office at 8 in the morning, clocking on, doing their thing, and then clocking off at the end of the day. So defending against them effectively means having the right type of protection. Protection that was doing a great job even 2-3 years ago may well not be doing a great job today, just because things have changed, they've moved on. The types of attacks we're seeing have changed so dramatically. We talk about phishing. Some of those, as I said, include things like URLs and attachments. But what we're seeing, and we've seen increasingly over the last few years, are, for example, malware-less attacks. So there is no malware, there's no link, there's no attachment. The attacker is using pure social engineering to try and get us to do something. And as you can imagine, because there's nothing bad in the email itself, it's actually pretty difficult to detect and stop. And not all security mechanisms are going to be able to do that. So you do need to look at what type of protection you have in place. Is it fit for purpose? Is it current? How regularly is it updated? How easily can it be updated? And that's, I guess, a good question when thinking about, well, do I deploy something myself on my own system on-prem, or do I use a cloud service? Cloud service should be, and generally is, a lot more easy to keep up to date and current. So you've really got to sort of look at the technology, and as I said, is it fit for purpose? Is it specifically designed to stop these more sophisticated and targeted attacks?
Right, okay. No, that's good to know. And obviously the other side of the coin is user education. And obviously there's one type of education which says, don't follow dodgy links out, which I guess you can kind of do training for. But to your point, Dan, about impersonation attacks, and you get an email from your CEO, how do you react to that if they're asking you to do something that they might seem like a typical request from your boss? Yeah,
and it's and that's why these types of attacks are being successful. I think the FBI have estimated that over $5 billion has been lost to these so-called impersonation attacks over the last few years, which is huge. And it's big companies, smaller companies falling prey to this. So as humans, we're all infallible. Sorry, we're not infallible, should I say? We're all fallible. That's why we're humans. We're going to make mistakes. So I think we talked about the right technology, but the right education has got to sit alongside that. Yeah. And as you say, if you get an email from somebody who, to all intents and purposes, looks like your boss emailing you, that can be quite convincing. And it takes quite a lot of consistent education for people to sort of be more wary of that, and ask the question, well, how often does the CEO generally email me? Maybe they email you all the time. Maybe you're a C-level exec. Have they ever emailed me about this with this type of request before? For example, it might be a request to transfer money to some bank account because the CEO is working on a deal that we need to sort of make some sort of down payment or something like that. So I guess it's just being more aware that even though something looks like it's legitimate, it may not well be legitimate. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's thinking before you action something. part of that is technology, but part of that is process. So a lot of the companies, for example, who have fallen prey to these impersonation attacks, if you get an email asking you to transfer £1 million, for example, there should be a process in place that is more than just, okay, I've got received an email from my CEO or the CFO asking me to do this. What kind of checks and balances? So again, it's technology, it's people, but equally process.
Yeah.
You know, what are the checks and balances you should do? Should you pick up the phone and actually ask them, hey, just to confirm, do you really want me to transfer this money, or send all of our P60s, for example, to somebody in HR, or somebody who they're saying is in HR, but perhaps it's not legitimate.
Sure. And how much control would IT have in terms of putting those processes in place and educating users, Bob?
I think when you're putting technology in place to help you deal with email threats, the technology is great. It will know a lot of stuff is plain bad. That's black, right? And it knows that, and you'll be amazed actually the amount of stuff that's being blocked, from just filling up our inboxes with rubbish to keeping serious threats at bay. They know about that. And there's the white stuff that can be proved more or less is good.
Okay.
And in between is grey. Now, if you're a user, you need to get your users to the level that they can recognise that it's something is at least in that grey area, and therefore treat it with caution. If it might be a bomb, then handle with extreme care, and don't pull any pins out or whatever. So, and I think the point is, as soon as you're in the grey area, as Dan said, if you're thinking, well, this is a bit of an unusual request to come from this person, or I've never had a request like this before, then don't be scared to go and check it out. Just do it, because you're going to look a lot sillier if you act on it than if you make a phone call asking, did you really want me to do this? And they say, well, yeah, of course I did. Get on and do your job. All right,
Sure.
Fair enough. I asked. So, and that's what these email tools are all about. They're all about keeping out the really bad stuff, the stuff we know is bad, letting through the stuff we know is good. And in this grey area, you get into this whole false positive, false negative business where the user's judgment really counts.
And technology seems to be play a role in nudging user behaviour as well, slightly, where it will flag this email might be suspect, for instance. Is that an important thing to?
Yeah. And let's face it, the tools have two goes at it as well. First of all, they can decide whether or not to let an email into your inbox, and then you as a user can open that email and decide what to do with it. But even at that stage, you can not have pictures downloaded and stuff like that. So, because don't forget that spoofers sometimes put images of text in emails to persuade you to click on them and stuff like that. So that's one thing that the tools can do. But secondly, once it's in your inbox, the action you take on the email, they can say, well, we don't reply with that sort of information. That's blocked, so you can block outgoing stuff. But also clicking on links, then you've got the filters around the links people click on to access the internet and say, we've double checked this. We think this is dangerous. So you can, first of all, you can block user behaviour. But you're right, Joe. You can also turn around and say, are you sure you want to do this? And a lot of these tools have started to build in user conditioning things. Like say this looks like a dodgy link. You're really sure you want to go ahead, and then if you say yes, well, that's been recorded. we did warn you. But and you can set the bar on these controls to where you like to suit your organisation. So
great.
And I think it's also how those things play together. Yeah. So user education on its own is not enough. Arguably, technology on its own is not enough. You have to put those two together, and some of the more effective ways I think of how they work is again where where the education and the technology work together. So if a user, for example, has clicked on a link in an email, and they might and they get a pop-up to say, this is actually what you've clicked on. This is where it's going to take you. Are you sure you want to go? They can make a judgment. They can say, yeah, I'm happy. Click. I want to go there. The technology is still going to play a part, because the technology is still then going to scan and make sure, is that destination site good or bad? If it's bad, we're still going to block you, even though you said you're happy to go forward. And all of that information can be logged. So IT and security professionals can start building up a better picture of who are their users who are just click happy. They're just going to open anything, click on anything. Which of those are a little bit more cautious, they're actually taking the time to think, is this taking me where I think it's taking me, and they're making more of the right decisions. And obviously those that are just click happy and you can focus more targeted education. And there's no one type of education. I think people quite often, when somebody starts in a company on day one, or certainly in their first week, they'll be sat in a classroom and they'll go through the security training.
Yeah.
And it will never be mentioned again. That person could have been there for however many years, right? Obviously that's not ideal. It's better than nothing, but it's not ideal. What can be done on a more regular basis, whether it's offline, sort of classroom-based, whether it's online, and ideally as part of their natural workflow.
Yeah.
So I mentioned the example of clicking a link and seeing something that's just making you stop and think before you continue through. Sort of part of the natural workflow, not interrupting their flow of work, but it's not taking them away from their desk.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm no expert on health and safety, but at work. But I think it's mandatory to have fire alarm, drills once a year. And we talk to these in terms of security as well. So you should have, for IT security teams, you should have a security incident drills regularly. What happens? But you could have that for users as well. And as Dan was referring to, it's not enough to give an induction training for an employee on email security. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be something you do once a year. And employees go, oh, we did this last year, but it doesn't matter. It's a reminder that it's important to the organisation they work for. And
yeah,
what's quite amazing is quite a lot of people say no matter how many times you tell somebody not to click, there will be people that will just click. And something like over 30% of people will click on a link in a malicious email within 10 minutes.
Wow.
Over 50% will click within an hour. So you can see that as much as you educate, there will be people who click. So combining the right protection and the education is obviously really where you got to go.
And in fairness, these web protection tools have an element of dynamism to them. So first of all, you might have a URL within an email that that's a safe address. It's one you use all the time. bbc.co.uk is the one everybody refers to. But that might actually be another URL hidden behind it. But secondly, there might be some website that is generally a good place to go to, but it's known to a good email security company that site is currently compromised, therefore it's unsafe for the time being. And that is the power of these tools, that you can't possibly do that in-house. You don't have the scale and the knowledge of what's going on the internet to be able to achieve that for your
And is that something that machine learning is playing a part in doing? And wider than that, how can machine learning kind of benefit IT departments when you're looking to kind of spot patterns in threat attacks on your email?
Well, machine learning is a very specific aspect of IT that we're all talking about a lot, and it's a subset of the whole artificial intelligence thing. Mm-hmm. What machine learning is doing is when an algorithm is handling data and information in a certain way, and it says, well, last time I did this, it was like that, therefore I'm going to adjust the algorithm itself. So the algorithm starts to rework itself based on previous experience. Then yes, there will be an element of those tools. I mean, Dan might be able to comment better on how an actual vendor is using that sort of technology within its own tool set to improve the way they work. But there's machine learning in general is being widely used in IT security to better understand threats. And of course, if an algorithm's updating itself and improving itself, that's happening sometimes in real time, because security threats can be emerging out of the blue, and suddenly all the tools have got to respond much faster than humans can program them, and then machine learning and the AI that follows from that can be very powerful.
Right.
I think especially with something like email and the volume of email, something like 250 billion emails sent and received every day.
That's just to me.
Sometimes seems that way, doesn't it?
Is that your inbox, Bob?
Yeah. But when you start handling big volumes of email, you start being able to learn a lot from what you're seeing on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So absolutely, to Bob's point, if the technology can self-learn and improve based on what it's seeing and what it's detected before or what it hasn't detected before, that's a key part of keeping the defense up to date and looking to try and get ahead, if possible, of where the attackers are at. I guess the flip of that is if companies are using machine learning, do we assume that attackers are starting to use machine learning? So then, that's going to be an interesting dynamic for sure. But it certainly plays a part in helping to keep defences current and up to date.
You bet attackers are using machine learning, yeah. The one thing we can learn from people who attack our organisations is they're clever people and they're going to be at the cutting edge, and that's why it's referred to as an arms race. And you might not approve of the motivation and methods of attackers, but one thing you have to accept is they're not stupid people, they're technologically clever. And don't forget, in many cases, when it's targeting businesses, these are people working for nation states. I'm using the term nation state because I'm trying not to say the names of individual countries. We've got an idea who those might be, and they're employing some of their very cleverest people to try and steal intellectual property from target organisations in the markets where we work. And I've no doubt there's people in our country who are doing things they shouldn't be doing as well, so I'm not but there you go.
And the threats are so varied, and they're after so many different types of things. You've got ransomware attacks like WannaCry, you've got impersonation attacks, and people trying to steal specific credentials. I suppose from a user education standpoint, you don't want to overload your staff with that kind of information, do you? So how do you educate them?
But if you start, the information that your organisation holds, it's the fundamental thing, and you need to protect it. So if you're focused on understanding and protecting the data your organisation holds, then the type of attack matters less because you focused on that. And there's two fundamental types of information that matter to an organisation. We're going to come on to this, I think, with regulations,
Sure.
But PII, or personally identifiable information, is the regulated personal data that your organisation holds, and intellectual property, that is that which is valuable to your organisation, financial information, product designs, all those sort of things, recipes, whatever, pharmaceutical formulas, all these things are really valuable to a company. If you focus on understanding your personal information that you hold and the intellectual property that holds and protect them, then whatever the attack method's being used, it's going to be harder for the attackers to get what they want. Not impossible, but...
Yeah, and I think for all of us as employees in our own right, it's putting it in terms that we understand. So, an organisation can stand up and say, we need to do more to protect our information and all that kind of thing. But if an individual in that company doesn't understand why that's so important, sort of building that scenario, if you like, for them, it's like, well, think about this. If you inadvertently send a customer list to somebody, you think you're sending it to person A, but you've actually slightly mistyped it, or the predictive thing in your Outlook has brought somebody else's name up and you haven't noticed, or all of these types of things can happen, and you've now just sent arguably one of our most critical forms of intellectual property, the list of our customers, to somebody, and who knows what's going to happen after that. Or if you divulge other forms of personally identifiable information, and it's bringing that to life for people, which I think helps for them to understand just how important it is. So it's not just the company's issue; it's everybody's issue.
Right.
And if this data gets out, what could that mean for the company? Well, there could be significant fines, and we'll come on to talk about this under GDPR. But reputational damage, it could really affect the company, and as employees, that's going to affect us. If you're a director in a company and something like there could be other things that could happen. Where you could be held personally accountable. So, but in my view, it's kind of making it more real than just saying, hey, we've got all this data and we all need to do our part. And it's like, here's what can happen. Paint the scenario.
Right. Make the consequences kind of real for them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a good time to come on to GDPR because as much as you do defend against a breach, they are not necessarily inevitable, but there's a high chance they'll happen. You've seen the number of breaches that have occurred, even just in the UK alone over the last couple of years. And in the US, SunTrust, I think just a few days ago, indicated that a former employee tried to steal 1.5 million customer records, which is a huge number, and it's difficult to defend against that sort of malicious internal threat. So I suppose there's a great incentive to make sure you are protecting your data as best you can under GDPR, and cyber resilience plays a big part in that. Dan, you mentioned the kind of data you're storing in your email is kind of customer records, it's internal IP, but there's a lot of personal data in there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, look, a huge proportion of information inside a company at some point passes through email. As we said earlier, it's the number one communication tool, both internally and externally for most companies around the world. So there's going to be a huge amount of information that's passing through that, and protecting it is certainly key. You know, we've talked about defending against these attacks. Now, you know, arguably, if you can put the best possible protection in against the most sophisticated attacks, you're going to be a long way down the road to defending against a breach. Unfortunately, in this day and age, I think anybody who sits and says, look, I've put all of this protection in, we're never going to be breached, is kidding themselves. I think at some point you have to assume something is going to get through, and it's at that point where, okay, defense is important, but what are the other steps that you've taken to protect the data itself, and to be able to operate, you know, continue operating as an organization during or immediately after a breach, and those things you know, are becoming more and more important, not only because of, you know, the world that we're in and our reliance on technology and email as a communication tool, for example, but when the regulation starts increasing and the implications of a breach start becoming more real and potentially more harmful to a company, more so than just sort of reputational damage. It starts bringing it to the fore of more people's minds.
Yeah, I completely agree. And since we're talking about email specifically, Bob, would you be able to just maybe highlight a few of the aspects of the legislation that pertain specifically to how people can kind of handle their email data better?
Yeah, let's be clear about the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. It's a non-prescriptive regulation, and it just deals with how you should treat personal information. So it doesn't have an awful lot to say about, I'm not going to say it doesn't mention email in it, but it's not going to have an awful lot to say about email directly. But remember, email is a generic tool and it's used for all sorts of reasons. And the very fact that you send somebody an email is a personal communication. So particularly if it's to a consumer outside your organisation responding to a product inquiry they've had, or, you know, a problem with their warranty or whatever it happens to be, then that's a personal communication as far as that person's concerned, so it's covered by GDPR. So emails are personal just because they're communications, but as Dan pointed out, sometimes they're used to purvey lists of personal information. That might be a perfectly valid thing to do. You might ask me to send a list of customers that need contacting about a certain problem with a product, and email might be the best way to convey that. There's nothing wrong in doing that, but if that email then gets printed out and put on a printer and then somebody throws it in the bin and it ends up in the public bin and somebody comes and fishes it out and said, oh, I got a list of customers with product problems here. So that's the scope of GDPR, because email is just a way of handling documents at the end of the day. They are just a type of document, an electronic document. And one of the things we look at it quite, I've looked at in the past, working with my former colleagues at QuoCirca, is the degree to which printed documents and printed emails become a problem. And I've seen that, people printing out their emails to take home and read, you know. So it's a very broad scope regulation.
There was a misconception that GDPR didn't apply to physical documents as well.
Oh, it does, yeah. I mean, the GDPR, I think it's got over 90 clauses in it, 90 sections, whatever the term is, you know, we like to think of it as a technology regulation. It's not. It's an information regulation. And in fact, the GDPR in the UK will be enforced by our own information commissioner, the ICO. And the ICO, just to be clear, we are, I think, broadcasting from the UK today. Well, I know we're broadcasting from the UK, but I think to a largely UK audience. But regardless, our own Information Commissioner, at the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO has confirmed that GDPR will apply in the UK after Brexit. And the reason for talking about that is, I've forgotten the question you answered originally now, but
no, that's really interesting. Carry on.
Yeah, was just to say that because we were talking about the printed document, weren't we?
Exactly. Yeah.
So oh yeah. Well, what I was going to say, I knew exactly what I was going to say, Joe. Yeah, the Information Commissioner's Office, the majority, about 40% of the leaks it recorded in the last 2 years were for paper-based breaches. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, nearly all those are in healthcare. And that is mostly the wrong document being sent to the wrong person.
Yeah.
But yes, it's as interested in paper-based breaches as it is in electronic breaches.
Yeah, and as you say, it will apply post-Brexit, and I think the UK is currently implementing a lot of it into its own new Data Protection Act, which is currently going through Parliament. So it will continue to apply. So any effort people make complying with GDPR isn't kind of ill-spent at all. One of the tenets of GDPR that was interesting to me, Dan, was how it empowers people to demand that organizations change their data or delete their data or move their data to a new provider. And obviously, for some people, their email archive is going to be locked up in a data silo somewhere. So I just wonder how you approach that as an organization looking to comply with those kind of requests.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Joe. I mean, from the 25th of May, all of us as European residents will be able to request what's known as a subject access request, which means you can go to any organization who you believe holds personal data on you and say, I'd like to know what data you hold on me, please. And that organization has 30 days to respond to that request. So for a lot of companies, that's going to be a new process which they need to set up and make sure they can actually fulfill that request within that 30-day period. And I think we're potentially likely to see a deluge of these requests as it becomes more known leading up to the 25th of May that you're able to do this. So you're going to get these requests. As you say, you've got to be able to fulfill these things. And from an email perspective, an email archive is that sort of complete repository of all email communication. So that is, from a data perspective, that's going to be your kind of go-to resource to be able to actually search and identify any communications that relate to that particular individual.
Right.
So you need the tools to be able to do that. And what I quite often say is GDPR is around, very much around a process, and technology is there to support that process. Mm-hmm. No technology, even if somebody says to you, buy my technology and we'll sort out your GDPR compliance, it's not true.
Yeah.
No technology can make you compliant. It can support the processes that you need to have set up in your organization to be compliant, or to be as compliant as you can be. So having the tools, so having an archive, if you have an archive, you're ahead of the game because you now have a complete set of data that you can go to be able to query and pull back that information. Once you've pulled it back, you need a way to be able to supply that securely to that data subject. So you can't just stick it in an unprotected email and shoot it out. There you go. Yeah. So that's got to be provided in a secure way. And then off the back of that request, that could be the end of it. Okay, I just want to know what you have on me. Okay, I'm fine with that. Or off the back of that request, there could be a number of other things that can be requested. So, for example, data portability is one of the areas of GDPR which relates to any data subject being able to request that their data, once they know what data is being held, be exported from company A and either provided to the data subject or to a designated third party. So I use the example of your accountant. Your accountant holds a huge amount of personal data on you. I decide I'm going to move my accountant. I want to start using somebody else. I can request my data, my personal data, from my current accountant and ask them to supply it to my new firm of accountants. Again, that all needs to be done securely.
Yeah.
They can also request if they see in the list of data that certain data is incorrect, they can request it be updated and made accurate. And then also one we hear a lot about is the right to be forgotten.
Sure.
So this is where, again, off the back of one of these searches, somebody can say, actually, I don't want you to hold my data anymore. I don't believe you have any interest to hold my data, or I'm withdrawing my consent that I might have given you in the past to hold my data. And again, organizations need to have the tools to be able to identify that particular data, so they're not getting rid of anything that they shouldn't be, but be able to fulfill that request in a reasonable amount of time to forget that person, to remove their data. But this is not a straightforward area, because there are circumstances where you're not obligated to remove all data that pertains to a person.
Yeah, that's right.
There could be other factors at play that actually override the requirements of GDPR. A good example is perhaps in financial services, and there are others across a whole bunch of other industries where you have a legal requirement, or there is another area of compliance that you are mandated to comply with that actually mandates that you retain information that might contain personal data for X period of time. So it's not as clear cut that if somebody asks you, you just have to delete it. You've actually got to look at, well, what is this data? Can I just get rid of it? Are there other factors at play, other regulations, for example, that mandate that I actually keep it? And as long as you can demonstrate to that individual that, look, I'm able to delete X, Y, and Z, but I'm not able to delete A, B, and C because of this. And as long as you can demonstrate that and you have a legitimate reason to keep it, then generally that's okay.
Okay, that's really interesting, where you might have to keep some data and delete others. I guess, is that from one central repository, or are you looking to use a couple of...
The GDPR is very explicit about the cases where that right to be forgotten doesn't apply. You can't ask to have your criminal record forgotten. You can't ask to be forgotten by the sex offenders register and stuff like that. So to state obvious ones, but there are good reasons. I mean, you work for a publisher. If you go and publish a story that's in public interest about an individual who's committed who's done something interesting in the IT industry, it might be a criminal thing or it might be a benevolent thing. You haven't got to forget that story if it's in the public interest and you published it. So although you publish some personal information about them, there's the legal obligations. You use the example of an accountant. Somebody might want to move their accountant, but their former accountant is obliged to keep records of the audit trails that they put in place for later reporting. And a big one, and it comes onto this archiving thing that I think you were alluding to, Joe, is that it's often in the it's in the public interest for people to be able to keep scientific and historical records, and they're often in archives. Now, when you retrieve data from an archive, there's obligations on you not to expose the personal elements of that archive data, although you need to keep it there. It's in all of our interests. For instance, it refers specifically to health data, because if you want to be able to use the historic records healthcare organisations keep about us as individuals to improve healthcare in the future, that's in all our interests, but they've got to be able to keep personal data to do that. And there's also, finally, for the establishment or exercise in defence of legal claims. So, if there's some legal process going on between you and me, then I have the right to store your data to pursue that legal case, and you can't request that I forget it. And also, the GDPR has a specific, it's actually Article 89, which refers specifically to archiving. And to understand this exposure of personal data, you need to understand the difference between your active database and the backups you keep of that, and the archive, which is the stuff you take out of active databases and put in the historic record. So if you are expected to forget somebody, you might forget them from the public database, you're no longer on our social media site. There's no record of you on it here, but I have got a historic record in our archive that you once were, and I might need to have that information for historical reasons or indeed for legal reasons. So, yes, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about an archive as well, the whole idea of, well, generally the reason somebody's had an archive, it's either because there is some compliance requirement for them to retain everything, but also a legal requirement, to support litigation, for example.
Sure.
So the whole idea of an archive is that it should be this immutable repository of data that can't be tampered with, that can be used as evidence, for example. So now we're saying, actually, you need to be able to get into that archive, potentially extract stuff, very specific stuff, and potentially remove something.
Yeah.
Again, as we've said, it's not always that straightforward, but the whole idea of an archive is it's supposed to be this thing, that you don't tamper with. But now we're not talking about tampering with it, but we're talking about being able to access it and things like that. And I think for a lot of companies, the archive has been this kind of store somewhere over there in the corner of the office that just does its thing and nobody's looked at for 10 years. But that is changing, and for a number of factors. But I think GDPR is forcing some organizations to look at how they store data and where they store data. So rather than a very hard to access silo of data that, break here in emergency type of access, it's becoming more important for that to be more easily accessible, more easily searchable, faster to search, faster to get the information out. And that type of thing is driving a lot more companies to look at how they deploy an archive. So for example, historically, people archived, on their own site, or either on disk or something like that. Increasingly, that's been moving to the cloud for a number of years. Some obvious benefits in terms of ease of deployment and cost, but equally the speed and ability to get at that information, both for compliance and regulatory purposes, but equally for just operational needs. So, me as an employee, how easy is it for me to find an email that, I know I sent Bob an email a couple of years ago and I know it said something very important in it. How easily can I find that? Because I'm going to be speaking to Bob in a couple of days and I want to reference back to that. So it can be used for a number of purposes. But I guess that old-fashioned view of an archive is changing and has changed for a lot of organizations. Others are still in the process of kind of thinking through that and how that should reside. But from an email perspective, the key thing is the archive of that information as a data silo, if you like.
Yeah.
Don't like the term silo because there shouldn't be these kind of walls around it. But equally, a backup as well. And I think the whole backup area is another thing that we need to think about, because it's depending on how you back up, it could become this separate data silo that now you've created two things from an email perspective you've got to manage. You've got your archive and you've got your backup.
Okay.
How do those things talk to each other?
Yeah.
Are they completely separate? If I action a right to be forgotten request in my archive, what happens to that information in the backup? Can I inadvertently recover that if something goes wrong in my systems and I have to use my backup for recovery? How effectively can I recover that? So ideally, having those two systems connected, and ideally one in the same, but being able to be used for different purposes, is a great route to go, because you only have to action something once. So if I remove somebody from my archive, I know that I'm not inadvertently going to recover them from my backup because it's a single data store. And when I remove it from the archive, it's gone from the backup, if I'm able to do that, unless there's some other overriding reason for me to keep it.
And if, let's say, very specifically for email marketing, for instance, somebody withdraws their consent for you to send them emails, but do you need to keep a record that that person has withdrawn their consent? And what does that mean for complying with GDPR? Because you're effectively you've still got a record of their data, even if it's just telling you not to include them on any newsletter lists or subscriptions anymore.
Yeah, let's be clear what the focus of GDPR is. Sure, it refers to any personal data, but what the regulators are really interested in is the commercial exploitation of personal data. So first of all, if you opt into a commercial process, and it might just be an emailing list, or it might be that you've joined a social media site, or you registered on an online retail site, then you're opting into a commercial process, and that should be clear. And you stay with that process. They can, if part of that opt-in is they can send you emails and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that happens until the day you turn around and say, sorry, I don't want to be part of this anymore. Now, if that is involved, for instance, if it was a bank, then you opt in to be a customer of the bank. You have an ongoing relationship with that bank. You have communications with them. Then you decide you want to close the bank account. You opt out. Of course, that bank is obliged to, because you've withdrawn your consent, to stop communicating with you, but it is obliged to keep records to show that you were once a customer and you had transactions with it. So again, it comes into this whole area of remembering that you've had a relationship with somebody in the past, but stopping communicating with them because they don't want that anymore. And whether or not that's covered by the right to be forgotten or the right to erasure will depend on the circumstances. And I think I just would make the other point that when it comes to something like managing an email list, there's probably a lot of people out there running small organizations with low-level communications with their customers, sending out a monthly email update and stuff like that. That is covered by GDPR, but the ICO is not sitting there thinking on the 25th of May next year, I'm coming for you guys, because they got a huge amount of work to do to put GDPR in place to regulate the activity that's going on that is covered by GDPR. The Information Commissioner's Office, that's the UK regulator, the ICO, it's recruiting quite a lot more staff to help deal with this, but it's not even doubling its staff as far as I can remember. And don't forget the government is focused on a lot of other things at the moment as well in the UK. So whilst nobody should ignore the impact that GDPR has on our organisation, providing you are thinking about the personal information you store and are taking appropriate steps to make sure it's protected, then it's not time to panic either.
And is there a risk-reward sort of ratio on the when you look at the customer data you store? I suppose what the question I'm trying to ask is, under GDPR, should you rethink the kinds of data you're keeping? Because some of it's going to have value, but it might not be worth the risk of a breach.
There's two. You're absolutely right, Joe. But there's two reasons for doing that.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, sure, one easy way to take yourself out of, to minimise the need for GDPR compliance, is to get rid of processing that involves personal data that you don't really need to do. There's two ways of doing that. First of all, you can say, well, why on earth are we doing this in the first place?
Yeah.
We didn't need to store that sort of data. We actually did that as an organisation. The last organisation I worked for, in our in some of our market research processes, we found we were storing the names of the people who responded to surveys. We didn't need it. We didn't need that data. We just stopped collecting it. So every survey was anonymised from the start, so it was no longer personal data. So there's things you can do along those lines. But the second reason for doing it is that GDPR demands it. GDPR has the concept of minimisation within it. So when you're collecting personal data, if I've got a relationship with your organisation and I say, well, I'm dealing with Joe and he comes from this organisation, here's his telephone number, here's his email address, and here's the name of his last 6 girlfriends, or whatever it happens to be. And I think, well, I don't really need that last information, get rid of it, don't store it. So you're not only does that make sense, but it's also a requirement. And when you fall foul of a data breach and the regulator comes along and they examine what happened, they say, well, okay, you have had a data breach, but you weren't storing that much personal information, and it's clear that you've gone through that process to minimise the amount you kept and you've done all you could to protect it. Obviously, you need to improve something because it's happened, but we can see that you were,
so they see
you're taking due diligence to protect the data, and that really matters.
Right.
And that, if you look at any of the judgments issued by the Information Commissioner's Office, and it's issued 215 enforcement actions in the last 2 years, so it's not a massive amount of these breaches that are being addressed. But when you look at the enforcement actions that it takes, it's always nuanced by the degree to which an organisation had taken steps to protect the data that was involved.
No, that's terrific. Absolutely.
I think just a comment I wanted to make is I think we've got to the point where, if you haven't heard about GDPR, I'm not sure where you've been because there's been so much talk about it, but it's I think we're past the point of sort of scaremongering, oh, you're going to get fined 4% of your global revenue and all this type of thing. It's not something we shouldn't think about, but at the same time, to Bob's point, it's like, the ICO and the other, regulatory bodies in other European countries and elsewhere around the world are going to be taking the view that, look, for your type of company, the size of organization you are, the type of personal data that you hold and you work with, have you taken reasonable steps?
Okay.
If you sit there and go, they come in for an audit and it's like, I've never heard of GDPR, then you're probably going to be in trouble. Yeah. But if you're able to sort of demonstrate, look, these are all the things we've done, these are the processes we've put in place, this is our understanding of where our data is, these are the levels of protection we've put in place, this is our process for dealing with a subject access request, et cetera, et cetera. The authorities are going to look and go, okay, that's reasonable for your type of an organization. And obviously, smaller companies arguably are going to be more limited by things like budget and resource, skills, potentially, than very large. So you've got to look at it reasonably and say, look, to Bob's point, they're not going to come in and sort of be looking for, oh, you forgot this little bit over there. We're going to take you to the cleaners. So I think now is the time, if organizations haven't started this process already, certainly start. But look at it objectively. Try and look at it in the way that the regulation is intended. Essentially, the regulation is there to improve the protection of all of our personal data. And certainly, for me, knowing that companies I deal with are taking this a lot more seriously than perhaps they've done in the past, gives me a good level of comfort that my data is going to be better protected. I know my data has been breached. I've received those letters through the mail from organizations saying, look, this has happened and these are the things we're making available to you. It's probably still going to happen, hopefully less, but at least we all know that companies are taking this more seriously. And as I said, flipping it from being this onerous task, which you can't get away from that for certain companies who perhaps haven't followed the data protection processes as much as others to date, but trying to flip it on the other side and see the positive of it.
Yeah, there is a fast route to compliance for certain processes. You can't. There's no fast route to compliance for your whole organisation, but there's certain processes that matter. I mean, a good example where most businesses do it is payroll processing. Of course, that handles personal data, some of our most personal data, but very few organisations do their own payroll processing. You outsource it to a payroll processor who, I can assure you, they would all have been looking at GDPR for a very long time and they're going to be getting it right. But let's say one of your key processes that deals with personal data is email marketing, email communications. There are organisations, if that's all you do, that's all you're worried about, that you can outsource that to. And every so often you say, I want to do an email run, I want to send this message to my customers, make sure it only goes to people who we know are opted in, make sure you've removed anybody who's opted out, and send it, and they do it for you. No, you are the person in control of that data. You are the data controller still. It's ultimately your responsibility, but you've got a service level agreement with that processor who's going to do it for you, and if they let you down, you can at least pass the fine on to them.
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of contracts underwrite that the third party will accept the fine, don't
you
they?
You can't outsource compliance.
No.
Essentially, as you said, Bob, it's still your responsibility. You've got to do the checks of any third parties that are processing data on your behalf to make sure they've done the right things.
Yeah, but you would do that anyway. In the process of appointing a third party to do a process for you, you go through due diligence and you make sure that the contract's in place. And yeah, cool, these things do break down, but we've been doing that for years. So that's not a new thing to check that you're getting what you expect from a service provider and what happens if they fail.
Yeah, absolutely fair point. I'm going to open up some audience questions because we've got a few. We'll just run through these as quickly as we can. We had one that was it's just disappeared.
It was about the weakest link, humans being the weakest link, wasn't it? I think.
Yes, which Dan, I think you were talking about this just before the webinar began, and it's you don't like the phrase "weakest link."
I find it puts too much onus on the employee to say you're doing the wrong thing. Right. You're the reason for the breach. And I guess the point I was making is I think all organisations have a responsibility to their staff to give them the right tools and the right education and the right information to help them make better decisions. I think when humans are involved, things are always going to go wrong. We're humans. We make mistakes. We're not machines. And that, I think, it comes back to the point we were talking about, which is, if we can improve the vigilance of humans, strengthen that human firewall. But at the same time, pair that with the right technology, that's going to put you in a lot better position.
Definitely. And Bob, I think you touched on this earlier. Does a subject access request include references to individuals within the context of emails? So I guess an email about somebody, does that constitute personal data?
That's going to depend very much on the context of the communication. So if you're a lawyer, communication with the court about a forthcoming trial in which Joe Curtis is up for, whatever, then God. Probably not. But if it's somebody wanting to know the degree to which a online retailer has been communicating about, probably one of the things an organisation needs to do is to limit the degree to which that sort of thing's done in an unstructured way with email, and make sure that a lot of the data about individuals is handled through a more formal thing,
and that's
where it can be
up to IT to set a process, put a process in place around that.
Yeah, that's an because if I asked to be forgotten by Amazon, I don't know, and 10 years ago I complained about something that happened and somebody solved my problem by sending an email to somebody else. I don't know. That's a huge undertaking for an organisation.
Sure.
So I would have thought that for a lot of organisations the best way is to make sure personal information is handled in a structured rather than an unstructured way.
Okay. And it's kind of a fun one. Dan, what's the best or your favourite scam email that you've ever seen?
Oh, my favourite for sure, the funniest one, which I'd be surprised if anybody falls for, but it's in existence, so you have to assume at some point somebody has, is the one about the Nigerian space program. I don't know if you've seen that one. Yeah. Where who knew that there's an astronaut who's been up there who lost his place on the shuttle coming back to a Russian, I believe, and it's going to take $3 million to bring him back. But obviously he's been earning money and he can't spend money in space, so he's got this massive coffer of cash, and then they'll give you some if you help get him back.
I think they were still flying up food supplies for him as well, but they couldn't put him on one of those shuttles back. So.
Something like that, yeah.
One for you, Bob.
The favourite scam email I've ever seen. I don't know. I have the funniest one, but I think the interesting ones are where you see substitute names and letters and stuff like that, or just the letters in a URL switched around so they look natural to you, particularly if you're a bit dyslexic like me. But and then you click on it, so you get some funny URLs. I can't think of one off the top of my head.
No, that's okay. That's quite good. And one thing I was wondering as well, actually, was you both mentioned rethinking the types of data you're storing and trying to make your email archive more accessible. Dan, you mentioned that there was so much like IP and knowledge stored in email. It's one of the biggest sort of data storage silos in an organization. By opening that up, I just wonder what kind of business benefits that kind of gives you.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to the type of organization you are. There are certain companies that are very, are in a very litigious industry, for example.
Yeah.
So if there may be another company, maybe a competitor who there's litigation between you, and they've got a very good and easily accessible archive, and you don't. Does somebody have a benefit there walking into a court? Who knows? Possibly. But I think the more realistic example for me is how easy it is, not just from a compliance or legal point of view, to use that information. But if you think about every email you've ever sent or received and the information that sits in that, there's business benefit to that. And just locking it away in an archive that only an IT person or administrator can ever access, or a legal person can ever access, you're reducing its value. So opening access up in a secure way to employees inside the business to be able to, as I gave the example before, being able to go back and find, I know I sent this email last week, a month ago, 5 years ago. I know it had something really important or witty or whatever it was in it, and I want to find it. How easily can I find it? How quickly can I find it? And that can help with making better decisions. It can help in sales situations, being able to find something that somebody said however long ago. So there's huge business value in that information. And I think for companies who have gone down the road of making their archive more accessible, more open, they're going to reap that benefit over those that it's still sort of a dusty archive in the corner.
Okay, fantastic. So we've talked about importance of email security, how to defend against various attacks, and the roles technology and user education play, and how both of those are really essential parts. I just wondered if you guys have a sort of final takeaway, as we're pretty much out of time. I'll start with you, Bob.
I think the most talked about one of the most talked about subjects in the IT industry at the moment, because it's prescient, is the General Data Protection Regulation. Don't panic, but think about the data you store, understand it, and make sure it's protected if you really need to keep storing it.
That's great. And Dan?
I think for me, and this relates directly to GDPR as well as the cyber side that we were talking about, is cybersecurity alone is no longer enough. You need to be thinking more in terms of cyber resilience. So what happens when something bad happens? Can I continue operating?
Yeah.
Can I recover that data? And I guess essentially to minimize the negative impact to my organization.
And that's really important to get back online. If you do have a subject access request for data deletion or something, you need to be able to honor that within the time frame rather than being offline and then falling out of compliance.
Correct.
Article 32 of GDPR says you must be able to do that. So.
There you go. Yeah, utterly essential. Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Dan, for taking the time to chat with me today about this. And thanks to everybody who tuned in for the broadcast.